Good morning, so I think we're going to get started. So I'd like to welcome you all this morning. Thank you all for joining us for our panel discussion on urban food security, food justice, and international agreements as levers for change. We selected this date to hold the event as it's right in between World Food Day, which happened last Tuesday, and World Cities Day, which is happening next Wednesday. This morning's panel discussion will begin with opening remarks from the Mayor Kitchener, Vrbanovic, and Dr. Jeff Jones, Associate Dean of Research at Wilfrid Laurier. Dr. Jones will pass the floor to Dr. Allison Blay-Palmer, our moderator for today's panel, who will introduce the topic and our panelists. The panelists will each be giving a short presentation on the topic as it relates to their area of expertise. This will be followed by a discussion led by the moderator, and then we'll open up the floor for questions from the audience. We're very pleased to have Mayor Vrbanovic with us this morning. Yes. Particularly due to his extensive international work as the treasurer and member of the presidency for the United Cities and Local Governments, an organization representing the interests of cities, local and regional governments, and municipal associations throughout the world. As a member of the presidency, Mayor Vrbanovic has participated in many high-level meetings at the United Nations for the Sustainable Development Goals and as part of the preparatory process for the new urban agenda. Through his work, he's bringing the voice of Canadians and North American municipalities to the global decision-making process. He's been an advocate for localizing the SDGs and developing clear metrics for progress. We'd like to thank you so much for joining us this morning, particularly as it was election night last night. It's great to have you here.
Well, thank you very much, and good morning, everyone. And it's a real pleasure to be here with all of you. And somebody said, "Well, it's unbelievable that you're here this morning." I said, number one, I can't say no to Elena, who I know works so hard and is so passionate on these issues. I've known Elena since she was a young lady. How old would you have been back then? 11 at the time, when her father served as mayor in our community. Some of you may know him, Dr. Richard Christie, who's also on faculty at Wilfrid Laurier University. But for me, it's a pleasure to be here and just share a few reflections with you, because I think it is so important for cities and communities to be engaged on some of these important issues at a global level. I think in particular the topic that you're going to be talking about locally here today is an interesting one as a region, as we grapple with our growth. So on the one end of things, the province has designated this area as an area for growth. But we've also said as a region that we have this hard countryside line because we want to protect our farmlands. And so what does that mean in terms of sustainable food systems and food security and so on? And so maybe some of those things will work themselves into your discussions today. But cities are very much represented through UCLG in a variety of UN processes, everything from COP21 in Paris. And some of you may have at that time heard of the meeting of 1,000 mayors that took place it was about a week before the final agreements. And it was, I think, part of what helped sort of take things over the top with some of those national leaders who were sort of going, I'm not sure about this and so on. It was a pretty powerful scene to see all of those mayors together at Paris City Hall and setting a strong statement about where we needed to go as cities on that issue globally. But beyond the COP process, obviously we've been very engaged with UN Habitat, with the whole new urban agenda and the SDG process amongst others. Interestingly enough, there is some interest locally in terms of localizing the SDGs, which I'm quite excited about. And there has been some preliminary dialogues amongst the CAOs of the region and the 7 municipalities to explore how, as we bring forward our new strat plans during the upcoming term of council, we can bring them forward in the context of the SDGs, so that we can monitor and see how we as a community are fitting into that. Some other communities like New York and so on have obviously been leaders on that issue, but with quite frankly all of the brain power and enthusiasm in this room, in this building, and in this community, I think it's also an opportunity for us to be leaders. And our community foundation, the KW Community Foundation, is participating in a process across the country amongst community foundations in order to look at how they can work with their municipalities in their particular communities to help localize the SDGs going forward. So in fact, just the week after next, I'm just trying to know where am I on my calendar. The week after next, I'll actually be in Madrid at our semi-annual board meeting of UCLG, and part of the agenda will actually be looking at the whole issue of localizing them, and was just in New York this past fall when our minister brought forward Canada's voluntary report with respect to how Canada was doing, and was pleased that actually part of his report, one of the things he included was something that Kitchener did, which was our digital Kitchener strategy, which obviously doesn't relate specifically to food systems, but again it was playing into some of what was being talked about on a global level. And I can't tell you how often I'm at meetings and the work of this region and the work of CG comes up in those processes. So I think all of you have something to really be proud of, and there's so much more that we can continue to do. So thank you for your work. Thank you for your interest in this topic. I'm not going to be able to stay with you all morning. It's a little bit of a busy day. I sort of did 4 radio stations already even before this morning, and so whoever asked them, did you sleep? The answer was just a little bit. And I look forward to hearing about the fruits of your discussions and hopefully joining you again in the future. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. I did get sleep last night, so I apologize for that. But I'm really happy that you're here. I think we're all really happy that you're here. And I'm really happy that I'm here, and I'm here to welcome you all on behalf of the Wilfrid Laurier University community to this fantastic event. I'm actually new to this role, maybe a little newer, as Associate Vice President of Research at Laurier. So it is a real pleasure to be able to come to these kinds of events and learn about the centers at Wilfrid Laurier University. One of the mistakes I made this morning was having my bran cereal before I came. And when I walked into the building, I could smell something coming down the hall and walking towards seeing what a light breakfast looks like at a food sustainability conference. Huge mistake. The other mistake was I wrote a formal speech. And it's a mistake because when I walk in this room, it feels like a lot of you know each other. And I feel there's a bit of a family atmosphere. So family and food seem to waft towards me. But I'm gonna, again, welcome you all, especially those of you who made the effort of traversing Highway 401 or perhaps an early GO train from outside of the city. And it is my honor to welcome you here, as well as to introduce your panel moderator, Dr. Allison Blay-Palmer. Laurier is home to more than 23 research centers and institutes involving faculty, postdoctoral fellows, staff, and students who are actively involved in many global interdisciplinary networks and intensive research programs, including the Laurier Center for Sustainable Food Systems. Under the direction of Dr. Alison Blay-Palmer, the center has been successful at securing a partnership grant for the FLEDGE Food Locally Embedded Globally Engaged project. This project included 14 co-applicants, 21 collaborators, and over 75 partner organizations that together have generated matching cash and in-kind support of over $1.5 million and provided support for 116 graduate student positions and 5 full-time postdoctoral fellows. This network and support continues to grow to further strengthen our food systems through innovation, effective leadership, and community engagement. Herbal, which is among my favorite names for a project, the Urban-Driven Innovations for Sustainable Food Systems project is the center's newest project. Herbal is focused on sustainable urban food systems in 8 cities around the world. The goal is to develop a tool to map the impact of innovations in the food system on food security, the environment, and the local community, to improve decisions made by managers and policymakers engaged in urban food systems. Dr. Allison Blay-Palmer is the Center for International Governance Innovation Chair in Sustainable Food Systems, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Canada's College of New Scholars, Artists, and Scientists, Founding Director of the Center for Sustainable Food Systems, and an Associate Professor in Geography and Environmental Studies at Wilfrid Laurier University. She is a leading researcher on sustainable food systems and communities and has made extensive academic contributions to shift the literature of economic geography to relocate food systems in a dynamic and complex city-region context. Her research and teaching combined her passions for sustainable food systems and governance. In 2017, she was a scientific advisor to the UN Food and Agricultural Organization, where she worked with colleagues on the City Region Food Systems Initiative. Allison has been on the forefront of linking sustainability and food and has created a robust network of researchers, community members, and those interested in food security, both locally and internationally, who are co-creating knowledge about sustainable regional food systems. Many of you here are probably here because of her continued efforts and infectious enthusiasm to create real change in urban food systems. Allison's commitment to community outreach, knowledge mobilization, and collaborators across Canada from sea to sea and beyond are a testament to her ability to bring together groups to have a meaningful conversation and to make collective action around social justice, prosperous economies, citizen engagement, and the role of food as a vehicle for positive change. If you're like me, the noise of day-to-day world politics can obscure the opportunities to improve the well-being of vulnerable populations and the environment. Agreements such as the new urban agenda are certainly something we should leverage. I wish you a fruitful discussion today, and I look forward to hearing more about the next steps in building your research networks and impacts both at home and abroad. It's my pleasure to welcome your moderator for today's discussion, Dr. Alison Blay-Palmer.
Thanks for those kind words, and thank you very much, Mayor Vrbanovic, for being here with us today, especially, and congratulations again. We're delighted to have you with us, especially given your active role in what we're going to be talking about today. So it's great to have you in the room, and thank you also for those kind words. I'm going to go through and welcome to everybody here. We're really delighted that you're able to join us, and we know how busy everybody is, so we're glad to have you all in the room with us for a short time. Just to begin, what I'd like to do is walk you through sort of some high-level points about the 3 of the agreements that we really want to be putting on the agenda for today's discussion. So these are the SDGs, the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, and specifically the New Urban Agenda, which is Elena Christie has been leading this initiative to have this event along with Amanda Di Battista, so we're very grateful to both of them for making this happen. And Elena came and said, you know, it would be really great to have a breakfast around the New Urban Agenda last spring, and I thought, wow, what a great idea. So here we all are. And she put together this introductory slide, and what strikes me about this is when you look at the dates, these are the dates when these were first adopted. This is very recent history, and yet despite that, these agreements have already had really are precipitating fundamental change in the way we see things. And I think it's really important to think about that, especially when we're facing challenging political situations in different realms. I think I get great encouragement from thinking about these agreements. So what I'd like to do really quickly, because we're a bit short on time, is just to run you through the most appropriate paragraph with respect to food is paragraph 1, 2, 3 in the New Urban Agenda. And there's 3 things that I'd like to draw your attention to. The first is, and I'm just going to go sentence by sentence. It parses out into 3 really neat little packages. And the first sentence focuses our attention on issues around social justice, access to food, poverty issues, but it also takes a bit of a different spin, and that's around territorialized food systems, which is a really important approach that I'm going to get back to again in a couple of other agreements. So that's the first sentence. The second sentence in paragraph 1, 2, 3 in the New Urban Agenda is this commitment to looking at food systems. So food systems are being approached all the way from food production, sustainable food production, all the way through to waste management. And then the last sentence I think is particularly interesting, and I know that there are some people in the room who would be really game to have an active conversation about some of the language here because it's a bit particular. It points to chemical use, so it reinforces the idea of sustainable agriculture, but it also talks about things like seed diversity, which is interesting to have specifically referenced in a document like this, as well as health and transportation, water and energy. So it gets at that food, energy, water, waste nexus that's really emerging as an important part of the global conversation and locally as well. The Milan Urban Food Policy Pact was first adopted in 2015, so we're moving a little bit backwards in time. But this is an initiative that was originally launched in Milan. It had about 110 signatories, I think, in the first year, and we're now up to about 180 cities around the world that have adopted this and are using it to help move their planning agenda forward. And it's specifically around urban food systems, so it's different from the New Urban Agenda that's much bigger. In terms of the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, as you can see, there are 6 areas. The first focuses on governance. The second issue is around sustainable diets and nutrition. The third issue looks at social and economic equity. And then the last 3 dimensions are focused on food systems. So integrating across that food system, again, all the way from production through to food waste. The last international framing agreement that I would like to bring to your attention is the one that was referenced by Mayor Vrbanovic, and that is the Sustainable Development Goals. And I'm sure that many of us in this room are familiar with this agreement. And what we're particularly interested in specifically is the Zero Hunger SDG 2, because that's really the most central SDG to food and food-related sustainable food issues. But all of them really can be integrated into a conversation around sustainable food. Okay, so I'm over time now. I'm going to go quickly, sorry. So all I want to do, this actually comes from a paper that came out in the Sustainability Journal this past spring that I co-authored with some people that who are working on the city region food systems. And what it points to is how integrative the idea of food can be in many different ways across the SDGs, and that's really part of what this conversation today is all about. So what I'd like to do now, thank you for giving me time to give you that overview, is just to really quickly introduce our panel. So our first speaker is Dr. Patricia Bellamingi, who is an associate professor at Carleton, who is cross-appointed to both the Department of Geography and Environmental Studies and the Institute of Political Economy. She's engaged in a broad range of experiences in the public, private, and nonprofit sectors, and this informs both her teaching and practice, as well as her research. As a community-engaged scholar, Patricia is most interested in practice, the application of theory, and she has served very diligently as on the board of Just Food Ottawa, leading it as a volunteer board member for a number of years, more than 8 years, with a goal to advance an action research agenda. Her research interests include localizing food systems and sustainable communities, aligning institutions for community impact, and also looking at areas of environmental conflict and deliberative democracy. So Trish is an active member of the Pledge Network and has been with us since pre-Pledge days, so we're really delighted to have her here with us. Barbara Emanuel is the manager of the Toronto Food Strategy. This is led by Toronto Public Health. The strategy proposes a new vision for Toronto's food. And as we all know, Toronto is a leader in this area internationally and within Canada. It's a strategy that integrates health and city building with the intent to build food connections across cities and within city divisions, between government and community, and between multiple food system stakeholders. So it's a very integrative approach with a goal of developing health and sustainable food systems for all. So it's inclusive as well. The food strategy builds on the strong foundation of the Toronto Food Policy Council that's been in operation for more than 27 years. So it's a landmark institution. Prior to her work on the food strategy, Barbara was a strategic policy advisor to the Medical Officer of Health for Toronto, where she worked on a range of local and global public health and environmental issues, so poising her perfectly for her present role. And she's also worked in the City of Toronto for over 25 years in a variety of policy and strategic issue roles. Before joining the City of Toronto, Barbara worked at the Development Education Centre, an adult ed resource center dedicated to international development and capacity building issues. So we're very glad to have Barbara joining us. The Toronto Public Health and the Toronto Food Policy Council are also active community partners in Pledge. And finally, it's my pleasure to introduce Dr. Teresa Shumalis, who is interested in ways that sustainable food movements in Canada are engaging with new online media spaces. She's actually leading a really groundbreaking organization called Open Food Network Canada. It's one of the many hats that she wears. She's interested through ethnographic and action research approaches to study how emerging digital economies, and that's part of the applied work is the Open Food Network, but she also theorizes this, and how digital economies and internet communications technologies are opening up new possibilities for linking together and scaling grassroots food innovation and enabling new forms of online activism toward transforming unsustainable food systems. So please help me welcome our distinguished panel. And Trish, I'll hand it over to you. Take your time.
I like grass fruit. I think you just coined a new term. Good morning, everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Allison, for the kind introduction. So, engaging with this topic spurred me to contemplate broadly the value of international agreements. On the one hand, of course, it's hard to argue against nation states, or in the case of the Milan Pact, urban centers joining to collaborate for better common futures. These types of agreements signal our joint commitment to work towards shared goals, enable states to align policies and programs with global efforts, and facilitate global connection to share exemplary practices. As the title of this session suggests, international agreements can serve as levers for change. They can be held up as discourses to be invoked strategically to advance political ends, helping civil society actors and other actors to name laudable targets and possibly shame governments for not making meaningful progress or congratulate them when they do. When the values embodied by a goal are progressive and emancipatory, related to equity, related to equity, equality, sustainability, as broad as that term is, and rights broadly conceived, thank you, Allison, and I'm including ecosystems rights and the rights of non-human species, then the potential for progress and transformation remains. But when the values embodied by a goal inadvertently normalize the very constructs that have resulted in our current ecological crisis, our enclosure and privatization of the commons, our obsession with growth, our dependency on extractivism, and our uncritical embrace of neoliberalism, which I recently heard characterized as capitalism on steroids, then clearly the globalization of values can be fraught. So I will skip a pebble across each of the three agreements. There we go. And now first with regards to the UNDP's 17 Sustainable Development Goals, shown here, it's worth restating, as Allison did, restating the obvious, that they're all iteratively interconnected. So for example, if you make progress on mitigating poverty, number one, through, I would argue, living wages, basic income guarantees, you necessarily alleviate food insecurity, zero hunger, number two. So the goals need to be understood as a performative matrix or interconnected web. I think Foucault would be proud. Second, and if you'll humor me, although I feel like I'm speaking to the converted here, and put your food systems goggles on, you quickly realize the centrality of achieving just and sustainable food and farming systems to achieving all other goals. So kids clearly need to be properly nourished before they can benefit from number four, quality education, as proponents of a national healthy food program know. Resilient urban food systems, ideally with some degree of local self-sufficiency and fairly traded connections to global supply chains, are critical to number 11, sustainable cities and communities. Greenhouse gas emissions from the food sector throughout the supply chain at each stage must be mitigated for us to effectively address climate change. And conversely, the food sector will need to adapt to our changing climate. So just examples of that interconnection. And third, the goals are laudable but broad and bland. I believe in life on land. This is number 15. Some are outcome driven, others process driven, but all are as wholesome as apple pie. So the devil will lie in the details of how they get implemented. Now, with regards to the new urban agenda, as Allison pointed out, paragraph 123 was actually inserted at the 11th hour. So this is a last minute inclusion. So food systems were not central to its development. I won't read the paragraph, but if you glance at the bolded terms, you'll see the content is framed primarily using discourses of food security, mitigation of food waste, which of course is highly topical, seed diversity, and efficiency. So an oddly specific set of references. Interestingly, the Government of Canada's Habitat 3, Canada's national report on the new urban agenda, aimed at anticipating and addressing the challenges of rapid urbanization. Oh, I see, that's why you're... There we go, I'm so sorry. Aimed at anticipating and addressing the challenges of rapid urbanization, makes only two explicit and exceedingly brief references to food. So why is it an add-on? I think the failure to systematically integrate food systems thinking into these frameworks reflects a lack of understanding of the complexity and enormity of the food system and its influence on sociocultural, economic, ecological, and notably climatic variables. As a local food justice advocate asserts, food systems are not yet understood as essential components to address all these sectors, constituting a form of food systems illiteracy. And this brings us to the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact. So while the SDGs and new urban agenda are adopted at the level of the nation state, cities sign on to this agreement. And I find this scale relevant because it corresponds largely to the scale of implementation, the scale at which city-region food systems can really be enacted. Clearly, cities play a critical role in advancing sustainable and just food systems. I asked around my food systems colleagues in Ottawa, and they replied, it's clear on the ground that local actors are paying attention to the Milan Pact. It's generating buzz. People are beginning to ask, if this isn't happening in our city, then why not? So Ottawa has not yet signed on, but as you'll hear from Barbara, Toronto has, and Vancouver and Montreal have as well. So if you're a big city, you have the capacity to invest in people to stay on top of these global agreements. In the case of Ottawa, my contact lamented, it's not that we haven't signed it, it simply was not on our radar. Had food justice organizations in Ottawa even known about it, they would have worked diligently to get the mayor on side. Of course, this points to the perpetual resource constraints faced by civil society actors, so insufficient core funding, time, connection, security, and thus agency. And I think not signing on at the initial stages represents a lost opportunity because you lose momentum. Now if you sign on, it's like, hey, I'm late to the party. It's not quite the same leverage. But fortunately, there can be peer pressure at the city level, and mayors of medium-sized cities want to keep up with the mayors of big-sized cities. Just Food has made a strategic decision to delay advocacy around the Milan Pact, aware that the indicator level work was coming, and I think you'll hear about that too, and to encourage participation in that. So the critical point is that for these agreements to serve as effective levers, they must give political credit to the politician who will then endorse them. I'll share with you an illustrative vignette. So how do these agreements play out in the local context? Just as I was contemplating that, Mayor Jim Watson, who was re-elected last night, spoke at an event organized on campus at Carleton, very convenient in the time slot I could make, Engineers Without Borders, on how Ottawa is implementing the SDGs. And he cited light rail phase 1, which is the single largest reduction in greenhouse gases in Ottawa's history, and Equipass, cycling infrastructure, energy efficiency retrofits, LEED standards on new buildings, all sorts of important initiatives, all related to the built environment and transportation. I was like listening attentively for anything related to food. But he was challenged, will your leadership ratchet up to another gear to give the dire IPCC call that we recently heard its due response? This is an ear-splitting wake-up call that we're running out of time, that the changes required will be far-reaching and unprecedented and impact us across all sectors. And he replied that it's nice to be aspirational, but you have to be realistic and set goals that are attainable. And of course, that's true, but how do we move beyond the plodding incremental rate of change? What I found interesting is that although the SDGs were plastered everywhere at the event, and I think they make for an attractive periodical table of sorts, there was no mention of a single goal. It's as if they're assumed to be the backdrop of the conversation, but not engaged with substantively. And of course, there was no mention of food systems beyond the oft-noted statistic that Ottawa is comprised of 82% rural land, and that's both agricultural and forest land. The city funds our community gardening network, but not the broader food systems work. So there's still tremendous potential to be made in this regard. And so the idea that we need stronger mechanisms for accountability at, for instance, I guess that was my last. Yeah, okay. Stronger mechanisms of accountability at, for instance, the city level in relation to national level commitments has led me to think about how these agreements articulate between local and global scales and all of the scales in between. And I think the risk is sometimes that policies get stuck at the federal level and they don't reach the people. There must be consideration of how these policies get implemented, because that can be very grassroots and contextualized, and mechanisms to achieve goals cannot be one size fits all. So how to connect across scales? I think it needs to be iterative in terms of top down and bottom up, and the interplay between the two. Grassroots actors with broader perspectives will be invaluable, as will policy leaders and decision makers with on the ground local experience and understanding of the role that they can play in the food systems. I think some municipalities haven't yet realized the role that they have to play with regards to food systems, and so they might need help or inspiration to put in place measures and policies to improve food systems. So I'll leave it at that and pass it on to my esteemed colleagues.
Well, it's great to be here. Full disclosure, I am not an academic. I'm thrilled that all of you in the room are doing such fabulous research that we shamelessly use and apply and need in order to make our work meaningful and having a strong research evidence base. So I am going to speak mostly about the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, but try to contextualize it in the broader area. So I'm the manager of the food strategy, as Allison said, and one of the challenges, but also opportunities for us in having a food strategy, is that it's a constantly evolving thing. It's not a fixed action plan or a set of recommendations, but is an ongoing process of identifying, building, and strengthening positive connections between multiple stakeholders And food lends itself very much to that, as we have heard. In terms of the specifics of the new urban agenda SDGs and the Milan Pact, I think what all of them help us do is integrate integrate food security and the nutritional needs of the urban poor, or not only the urban poor, for the broader ones. And it also applies a broad food systems approach that recognizes also the impact of urbanization, which of course is a global phenomenon, and a need to facilitate strong urban-rural linkages. And cities, therefore, have a major role to play. And as Trish had said, I strongly believe that food is an element that connects all the SDGs. But certainly in the City of Toronto, the SDGs are not explicitly talked about and acted on, but are sort of more embedded behind the different strategies and action plans. But the Milan Pact itself is directly applicable because we are a signatory, and that we are lucky enough to have both a very strong Food Policy Council to advocate for food systems issues and food strategy. So one of the big challenges around these big global agreements, but also about even a food systems approach, it's really hard to explain to the powers that be, what is a food systems approach? We struggle with that all the time. And decision makers and politicians want a one-pager that says everything that you do in terms of a food systems approach, explain it in a way that I understand, but that is evidence-based and that is actionable and all of that. So we were issued a challenge by our politicians to describe a food system approach and what is this Milan Urban Food Policy Pact in real terms. So we took on this challenge and we decided to be very intentional and strategic about reflecting on our progress on food systems transformation by applying the Milan Urban Pact to our work in a very systematic way. So we did the three things where we reflected on our programs. We began a City of Toronto food initiatives mapping process, and that was a huge undertaking. It was really interesting process, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. So we decided to concretize our thinking in a report to the Board of Health, and at a high level in going through this process, we were able to succinctly identify new priority areas, and those are sustainable diets and nutrition, which for us in public health is a way of just approaching things in an ecological public health domain. We saw the importance of prioritizing resilience and conducting food vulnerability assessment of the City of Toronto, and we also see that we haven't done nearly enough on food systems waste. I'm going to share a little bit now. The details aren't as important as perhaps the process, but as you know, when you try to define the food system and food system change, there's so many different ways that you can slice and dice this. What are the themes? What are the action streams? And we spent a lot of time initially coming up with those action streams that are on the left of this slide: culture shift, healthy food access, community building and engagement, looking at land and property and the food supply chain. And so we were willing just to let that go because we knew that there are lots of other ways of describing it, and perhaps it made sense for us to try to be more in sync with other cities at a global level by seeing how and if the Milan Pact action themes worked. So the Milan Pact themes are those in the center there. And when we started to do our own analysis, we found that they didn't quite exactly fit for us. They were close, but that we had to adapt it to what made sense for us on the ground. So what you see on the right is where we have landed in our adaptation of the Milan Pact. And those action streams of governance, which is really about the enabling environment. We've used a broader health frame, which embeds sustainable diets and nutrition. We've kept the social and economic equity. We've put production, supply, and distribution together. That's the entire food chain there. And we added system into food waste so that it was really intentional about food waste at every point in the food system, because I think when we talk about food waste, people tend to think about it as the consumption end primarily. This completely chaotic, colorful diagram, the content specifically is less important, but what we did here was mapped all the City of Toronto food initiatives that we could find and we could think of. And in so doing this, it was a really fascinating and exciting engagement process, because what happened here is there were some food initiatives that are explicitly and intentionally about food. But frankly, most of the work that we do at city government doesn't have food in the program title, but has all sorts of things to do with food, whether it's economic development or licensing or zoning or any of those things. And the trick here is to begin this mapping process and talk to colleagues right across multiple departments and divisions, and to enable them to see themselves in food. And it becomes a really effective engagement process where it's not threatening to come and say, take a food systems approach, because you can say you are part of the food system in your economic development process, in your zoning, in your whatever. So then the next step that we did, again, the details are less important. The Milan Pact indicator framework came up with 44 indicators. It's huge, it's overwhelming. And what we decided to really embrace this, because there'd been a lot of thinking that's gone into developing this set of indicators. Why not use it? Why not see what works and what doesn't work? And so what we did was went through each of those indicators, and some of them obviously didn't apply to us. Very few of them didn't apply to us in the City of Toronto. But those indicators that might actually have some merit, we kept. And we started to do some research about where the data exists. Does it exist for that? We, at the same time, adapted the indicator framework, and we mapped on all the initiatives that you saw in the previous slide, and found that they all fit into the framework somewhere, and in fact fit into multiple places in the framework. We were able to identify which was the responsible division or department that for each of those indicators, and what are the data sources. So it's given us a very much more granular sense of where things are at with the framework, and it was a huge effort. I think it's worth it. We are still trying to figure that part out. So one of at the high level, why is this? Oh, I see. At the high level, what we have found with the framework is there's an absence of environmental specific goals and areas where the data is sparse, but the process is important for engagement. But now what? So what? We've got this wonderful framework, we've got all this data, we've got all these metrics. What's the significance of it? What stories can we tell out of this baseline data? What is it actually telling us about where we are? And what we have seen is that it's a good starting point, really, to tell us where the gaps are and to begin the engagement process. We now are lucky enough to be working with Mary Caesars in the room here, with some folks to help us tell that story so that this populated framework becomes more alive. Thank you.
Good morning. Thanks. This is a big moment for us. This isn't an agenda that was handed down to us. This is our language reflected back to us. This is us. This is our party, and we'll whine if we want to. And I am going to whine a little bit. I'm going to very quickly, okay, which thing do I push? This is very confusing. No. Oh, this one? I think not. That one, okay. Okay, perfect, no problem. So one of the questions is, what do these evolving international agreements mean for building sustainable food systems? Not sure that's the question I'm going to answer. Oops. I'm going to say, okay, finally you get it, so let me demand that you go further. Because I think the onus is on us as grassroots activists and researchers and academics to keep pushing the agenda even before the current agenda is fully implemented. Because it took us 25 years to get food systems endorsed at the national level. So we better start moving on to the next thing now. Why does that keep, I must keep hitting my thumb is too fat. Okay. We've gone through the language thing. Don't need to say that again. I'm going to reflect to you from two different perspectives. One, briefly, similar to Barbara's. I had the pleasure of working for the region of Waterloo for 24 years, 15 years spent on sustainable food system agenda. And this was before any international agreement. So we didn't have any of that. But as a rural-urban municipality, we were doing what we now call city-region food system planning. That how you bring the urban and the peri-urban and the rural together onto the same page. And perhaps it was of great urgency here in 1999 when we started this work, because we knew we were a target for growth given proximity to the GTA. We knew that we were rapidly losing agricultural land and rural culture, and that was really important to lots of people here, and that's why we started this work. And we did what Barbara has described, in the same thing, came up with the frameworks, generated all the data, multiple reports, brought politicians online. We had a cross-functional team across transportation planning, land use planning, public health planning, social services planning. We were all working together on agendas. And 15 FTEs, 15 years later, 30-some mega reports, some of which generated methodologies for how one assesses food systems, because nobody had done that yet. How one calculates redundant trade in a region. Where do you get the data for that? All of these things, and it died. It ended. Not without impact, because of course much of the work still lives in other contexts. And I would say we still have the strongest integration of food systems into the regional official plan that anywhere. So there's some really positive things here, and all the people are still here and ready to engage again. But why did it die? I think depending on who you ask, you would get a different answer to that. I think one of the issues is a question of mandates. That really, because we are a creature of the province, we exist at the pleasure of the province. You know, cities in Canada are not in the Constitution, right? We're created, and our mandates are created. And so without a provincial endorsement of this work, very explicitly, it was always the target for cuts and changes, and ultimately that happened. Whether signing on as a region or as a city to the new urban agenda, for example, or the Milan Policy Pact, for example, can substitute for that absence of provincial mandate is a really interesting question. And had we had that kind of signature, if nothing else, it would have been embarrassing to stop the work. It would have been publicly embarrassing. And that might have just kept it alive, and it could rekindle it still, because now we have a new moment. We can kind of start again with some fresh support. The second perspective I want to talk about relates more to my current work, which is around the digital data, smartness. We all want to be smart. And as I was first reading the new urban agenda, paragraph 66, which came before the food paragraph, and I have to say, as I got past 50, and I'm like, oh my God, here we go, blah, 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 blah. And then 66 jumped out at me because it says, we commit ourselves to adopting a smart city. I looked away from my screen and I just said, please save us. I can't believe that this too is going to the word smartness, which is completely undefined, complete non-existence of agreement. And really, when it comes to the idea of a smart city, which implies some kind of integration of data that might be owned from somewhere or collected from somewhere, we don't know who, we are at this point of understanding smart cities where we were about understanding what the heck a sustainable food system means 30 years ago. So our opportunity, as I came to get back engaged on my screen and continue reading, I think is to shape what it means for food systems to have a smart city. And as of yet, our understanding of sustainable food systems is not integrated into the way cities are talking about digital technologies and smart cities, and it could be. So whether we take that from production to process to consumption kind of chain as our framework for that, or whether we come up with another one, is kind of an open question. But for sure, in doing that, and the reason it's important for us to do this, is that what we know from our previous experiences is we can bring the question of who is setting the agenda and who is generating the data and who is owning the data. And here, my folks, my friends, there is no surprises. The same story that happened with, let's just pick seeds as an example because it's a nice one, is happening with the smartness. Smart cities, smart agriculture, smart food is all about large agricultural input companies who have now branched out into the development of all kinds of digital technologies and data collecting devices, systems, and ownership. What's interesting is at the same time, unlike when we figured out the seed thing, we were already behind the agenda, behind the 8 ball, right? We're ahead here because we still have a situation where actually there's a huge amount, a huge diversity of independent thinking going into this, and smaller scale app developers who are just amazing to work with. This is just a picture of the digital space related to smart cities on the African continent. Lots of independence, consolidating really fast, but these are our new partners, folks. These are the new people we need to start working with. And I want to just close by introducing you to what I think is a window into this. Open Food Network Canada is a national not-for-profit that works with sister organizations, also called Open Food Networks, all around the world. Our agenda is to identify, write, curate open source code to build a commons, a technological commons that can serve the advancement of food sustainability around the world. And the way we fund this work is through a platform that's also called Open Food Network, which is why it gets confusing. Right now, this isn't showing up very well, we're gradually extending to countries around the world, and we pay for this work through user fees on the platform, which is a distributed marketing, logistics, distribution kind of food platform. And I won't speak more about the platform. We can do this in discussions if we want. What I want to conclude with is how can these new international agreements be more useful for us? I think there's a few points to bear in mind. The first is they need to be flexible and have inclusive metrics. Everybody needs to be able to see themselves in those metrics somehow, and I'm not sure that's the case right now. I think we all have to be equally inclusive in our data collection approaches, and boy, do we ever have options. Does technology ever give us options to be inclusive in that? And we should be pushing that agenda, especially if we're all trying to be so smart. And I think we need to be inclusive of non-cities in some way. I'm not sure what the hope is in a province like Ontario if Ontario isn't somehow see itself in this. I think it's a problem we got to talk through. And we have to keep asking who owns the tech. And we have to understand that without tech and data sovereignty, we can't have food sovereignty. These things are combined, and the movement for a free and open internet is the movement for international global justice. It's the same movement. And so we need to get our heads to that, and we need to roll up our sleeves, get on our helmets, get back in the game, and start figuring out how we integrate sustainable food systems into smartness.
Wow, okay. We've got lots to talk about and not enough time to do it in, but we're gonna take a stab at a few questions that were prepared for the panel. Thank you very much for incredibly insightful comments and a really stimulating set of presentations. What I'd like to do first is put a few questions to the panel that we prepared in advance, and then depending on how that's going, within the next 10 to 15 minutes, maybe open up to the floor. Are there people in our audience who have questions that they'd like to put to the panel? Awesome, okay. So we'll try to get to those as quickly as we can. The first question that we wanted to put to everybody, are your mics working? Testing. Hello. Okay. Testing. Okay. Okay. And Teresa sort of, and I guess everybody touched on this question a little bit in their presentations. Maybe Trish, we could start with you if your mic is working. The light seems to be on. Testing. Okay, maybe Teresa, you can just pass your mic down.
Now it's working.
Okay, awesome. Thank you so much. Thanks, Amanda and Elena. So when we think about these international global governance agreements, or more locally focused like the Milan Urban Food Policy Pact, do you think that these agreements in some way can or do facilitate conversations around food policy that otherwise wouldn't exist? And this is a bit of a tough question because, as we pointed out at the very beginning, we haven't had these agreements for very long, 2015 and 2016 in total. So if you can contextualize your answer and sort of temper it with that, maybe think about it more aspirationally, that would be great. So Trish, if you want to lead off, that would be lovely.
Absolutely. So I would say the jury is still out in Ottawa, but I see tremendous potential and promise with the Milan Pact in particular. I think I can imagine quite easily the potential for a second recruitment wave to encourage small and mid-sized centers to sign on. and to give the mayors their due and their acknowledgement for doing that. If you look at the Milan Awards, it's a panoply of different exemplary practices that you really can draw inspiration from. So it helps to disseminate ideas, from pop-up markets in subways in Toronto to community dining halls in Mexico City to the redistribution of surplus food in Belo Horizonte in Brazil. So that involves really a globalizing of social innovation. So I think, that type of knowledge translation, recognizing that when we're talking about diffusing out projects or scaling up projects, we always have to be very place-based and contextualized. So it always comes with a caveat that you can't just fall into the replication mantra, but I do think that there's tremendous potential in those types of pacts for disseminating really wonderful and innovative projects.
Barbara, yeah.
Building on what Trish said, I think we have been able to use the Milan Pact effectively in Toronto to galvanize energy and action, as I indicated before. I think there's not, unfortunately, enough interest about the broader global context at the decision-making level in Toronto. I think that all the global agendas are unfortunately seen a bit too much as for over there, for the global south. Doesn't really apply to us. We don't have hunger, but I think those of us working on the ground can use it to push things. I think for the Milan Pact, however, it has very much networked our work at a global level in a very pragmatic way. So whether it's information sharing or strategic conversations, and in fact the awards that Trish talked about, one of the frankly unintended very positive impacts from the Milan Pact are these awards. They now have about 200 and something applications, all organized under the different themes and at a global level. And unwittingly, these have become a composite repository for good practice at a global level. And just this last year, they did some analysis that showed they looked at 50 of these 200, and it's a fantastic compendium. So that's kind of galvanized our thinking, and we are beginning some early conversations to try and get something like that embedded in Canada. So maybe we'll be partnering with you to do that at the policy level with Food Secure Canada, to do it at the practice and community level. So it's a very exciting unintended impact, actually.
I also think they bring an opportunity. I think we need to translate that opportunity for mid-sized cities, though. And I think that's because A, that's where the growth is now going to happen, mid-sized cities. And B, I think that's where the disconnect is between, the international. It's even more of a gap. And I think the way we have to do that is by somehow organizing, food system work that is happening in municipalities across the country in some kind of a network first, and then very strategically target a rollout and endorsement campaign that we roll out to cities across the country to sign on to these agreements.
Thanks very much for your insights. One of the things that we're also interested in, given the topic for today, is around social justice and whether or not you think that the agreements can help or have helped in some way address that specific issue. And we're also interested in, and I think you've already engaged with this idea enough, but you might want to pick it up again, is are you seeing these agreements as somehow helping us think about food in a more systemic way? So that integration piece that has come up in many of the talks that you just shared with us. Teresa, do you want to start with that? I see you nodding enthusiastically.
Well,
so.
in my experience, at the grassroots here, we have been thinking integrated about this for a long time. And finally, we have gotten others to recognize that. So that's fantastic. I think, as I've said, for me, the new angle is to pick up on the smart themes. And smart data is not going away, smart cities are not going away, and the people who are starting to control that agenda are not the people who we want to control that agenda. And we have an opportunity to do our own thinking and our own development work, just as we designed what a sustainable food systems was. It didn't come from anywhere, we built it. And we can build what a smart city is as it relates to sustainable food and food justice and make sure that that's there. And I think we need to do that.
It's okay for us to engage, I think. I don't know how people are sitting so still when we have so much truth coming. Like 5 years ago, to hear someone use the word extractivist on a panel at a university brings music to my ears. So I'm sorry, I can't just hear and contain myself.
Well, we appreciate your enthusiasm. Thank you.
On Twitter too.
Yeah, you're tweeting it out?
Tweeting.
Oh, awesome. Thank you so much. That's great. Barbara, do you have any insights around social justice or food systems?
I think it helps by bringing an organizing framework to what's already happening, but sometimes in a more siloed practice, if you like, on the ground. And so, as we all know, and that's why we're here, food is the great connector and integrator. I think it is a slight weakness in, for example, SDGs. While it's covered, if you look at them as a composite entity, I think being more explicit and intentional about food as a potential connector for all this work, I think could be made a little bit more intentional, I suppose. But we invoke it as an organizing framework to just facilitate the connectivity and integration.
I think we're all gaining in terms of our food systems literacy, all actors, whether civil society or governmental or citizens. And our research in Ottawa into how difficult it is to work with food systems language actually highlighted that tension. It's very difficult to convey something as complex as a food system, and we found that different actors were strategically invoking it, but some were just discrete food access projects, whereas other actors were actually doing more food systems work. And in fact, as an illustrative vignette, the Community Foundation of Ottawa, which funds some really wonderful work, had a food systems grant, and unfortunately they had it as a Dragon's Den style competition, which is a somewhat demoralizing prospect for different nonprofits to go up against one another and try to pitch against each other. And the panel awarded the project to a worthwhile project, but it was a discrete food access project. And Just Food had purported a community food hub, which would have aggregated local production. Currently they were driving to the Toronto Food Terminal, which is absurd, and helped to distribute to community partners, nonprofit and public sector partners. So that is a food systems project. We figured we're the only food systems project that could be eligible for this grant. But it's very difficult to convey something of that complexity. And so something that's much more tangible, where people can see food delivered to vulnerable people, a discrete food access project, as worthwhile as that is easier to convey. So all of that to say, I think the Milan Pact, it has a glossary of terms and not a homogenizing of our understanding, but as we gain in our understanding of food systems and harmonizing the language that we're using and truly understanding what a food systems approach entails, I think that that's progress. In terms of social justice, are you thinking around food justice? So I feel like we still need to push the envelope even further. We haven't yet spoken about food as a basic human right entrenched in legislation. When we talk about economic security, we're just starting to talk about basic income guarantees, living wages. Are we talking adequately about farmer livelihoods and, as I mentioned, food literacy and all of the food sovereignty principles about meaningful, deliberative participation of individuals and citizens and eaters at every stage of the food system. So I feel like there's tremendous potential, but we still need to continually press and push the envelope.
Okay, thank you very much, all of you. There's just one more question that I'm going to put to you, and then I think we'll open it up to the floor. And that is, if we could go back, or if we could write a new international agreement, what's missing from the SDGs, the Milan Pact, and the New Urban Agenda that you think would help us move the conversation forward a little bit from the food system, sustainable food systems perspective? So that's sort of a combination of the questions that we had talked about, but I think that's a good last question. Is there anybody who wants to pick that up, or should we? Teresa?
Yeah.
All right, thanks.
Well, there's no if. We can write a new one anytime. It's just up to us to do it, right? We did this one.
Yeah.
So, labor justice, food labor justice, any kind of labor justice, I think deserves a higher profile than it's there. I think there's minor things like the role, given that states are signing on to this and cities are signing on to this, the role of government institutions in actual purchasing local sustainable food is almost like the low-hanging fruit thing that could be there. But for me, the big thing is that it is silent on issues of sovereignty, including data sovereignty. And I know that's a big thing, and I know it's a big aspirational thing, but that's got to be where we move. I mean, look at the seeds thing. I fell off my chair when I saw the mention of seeds in, chapter 1, 2, 3 there. I mean, that blew me away. That's big. So it's a big opener to sovereignty in other ways.
Barbara, Trish, do you want more time?
Well, I'm not sure these are completely absent, but I think a clearer language interpretation of the two concepts of, the one concept is sustainable diets, so that people really understand that food and food systems have to take into account both human health and planetary health. And that's an intuitive thing to really understand, but I don't think the Milan Pact has done that well, actually, for example. And then the other concept that I think brings us very much together in both the global north and the south, and that is the concept of community food resilience. The whole resilience work in the context of climate change, in the context of food security, in the context of rights and justice, I think needs to be a little bit more intentional and transparent in these documents. Those were my two thoughts.
I think I'd just echo the point I made earlier about those aspects of food justice and a more explicit food sovereignty lens. I think, teasing out some of the underlying political issues and looking at the power dynamics involved with actors with who are differentiated in their power. I think that's a lens that would be productive moving forward.
All right, well, this is an amazing beginning to some questions that I think are burning to be asked. So Elena has a mic and Amanda has a mic. So if you want to put your hands up, we'll bring the mics to you. And if you can identify yourself, please, so that we know, our panelists know who they're speaking to, that'd be great. And also, just full disclosure, this is being recorded. So if that's an issue for you, please let us know.
My name is Sebi Sama, and I'm a postdoctoral fellow at CG. And my question is to everyone. So Canada and others have agreed to the Sustainable Development Goals that no one should be left behind. And Canada's Minister of International Development and La Francophonie said the Sustainable Development Goals will not be said to have been achieved unless it is achieved for everyone and everywhere. And Canada has done a lot, or Canada is trying to look at what Canadian financial players are doing in other countries when it comes to mining, the implications for local communities. And currently, there are a number of Canadian companies, financial players in Africa, for instance, involved in activities that are leading to land grabbing. And we know that land grabbing undermines most of these things that we are talking about, social justice. So my question is to everyone. I would like to know if the government of Canada, what is the government doing? We know that in the majority of the African countries, for instance, the systems that are in place, they are not effective enough to regulate some of these investments. So what is Canada doing, or what is your organization doing to ensure that the people that way also are not left behind, to ensure that while they are trying to establish these investments that are meant to promote food security, is not necessarily there, but elsewhere, because most of the time the food is cultivated to be exported elsewhere. Maybe they are cultivated for energy security elsewhere, or maybe they are cultivated for for climate change issues. So what is Canada doing, and what is your organization doing to ensure that those investments, which cannot be regulated by those African governments, promote social justice, promote food justice, promote environmental justice and food sovereignty? Thank you.
Well, to be honest, this really falls beyond the scope of my expertise. I'm really quite conversant with localized food systems, but I share those concerns and feel that there's great hypocrisy at the international level in terms of some of those practices. But I don't think I have enough to really form a more detailed response.
I was going to say similarly, I mean, for me, I work more with data grabbing, which is a direct parallel to land grabbing in pretty much every way. And I guess in terms of what actions we take, I think it's actions like we're doing now. I think it's raising the agenda, it's raising the discussion, it's commenting on it, these themes in our publications and in our discourse. And I wish I could speak for the Canadian government, but I can't. And on this issue, I totally concur with you that you described it. It's hypocritical. Shameful.
Yeah, and I think because this is not my area of expertise either, but I really appreciate the question, and I would appreciate an opportunity to engage in this further with you. But I think one of the challenges with the SDGs that got named in passing is the fact that a lot of countries, and there's actually a paper about the UK stating this outright, they don't see the SDGs as applying to them. They see the SDGs as a global south issue. And as long as that's the case, it's not the intent of the SDGs, but as long as that's the case and people don't see it as a global initiative where everybody has to come to the table and report on what they're up to, which is happening through the voluntary national reviews, I think there's a disconnect there that also needs to be addressed and leads to things like land grabbing. So it's a very apt question. Thank you.
Hi there, my name is Lynn Roblin, and I'm a registered dietitian with the Ontario Public Health Association, and I'm working at the Nutrition Resource Centre. So one of my passionate projects over the last 5 years has been working on the Ontario Food and Nutrition Strategy, and this work was happening before all of these pacts were even brought to the forefront. So it's interesting to see a lot of parallels between some of the key action areas that we identified as part of those SDGs. My question is really around how we can collaborate more and better. I'm also a board member of Sustain Ontario, so we're very supportive of all this work on sustainable foods and food systems. And the priorities in the Ontario Food and Nutrition Strategy were around healthy food access, food literacy, and promoting healthy food systems. We have a government, as Teresa mentioned, that has no mandate for healthy food systems, and food systems does cross many barriers and very many ministries. So how can we work better with Food Secure Canada, Sustain Ontario, The work with the Ontario Food and Nutrition Strategy kind of froze after we released our technical document. We've been working on it for so long, but then people kind of lost energy and like, okay, now what's next? And Barbara, I'm really pleased to see how you had integrated the Milan recommendations and you started to use the indicators. So again, we need common indicators to measure progress on our food systems work. So it's really a question about how can we work better together? How can we make this more of a priority for our governments? The federal government's taking some leadership with a food policy for Canada, but we don't see that same level of commitment here in Ontario.
I'm so glad to see you here, Lynn. It's nice to see you again. I think it's shocking that we can have language for sustainable food systems in an international agreement and have it absolutely absent in our own province. That we can have cities signing on to that language and have it absent in our province. I don't know, I don't have a clear answer for you on the how, but I think these networks that you've identified need to expand around that problem in particular. Like, there is the need for some concentrated advocacy here to let's wake up Ontario. Let's put this on Ontario's agenda.
I hope I'm not going to sound too cynical, but I have, been working at a government level for a really long time, and I think we all talk about collaboration all the time and the importance, and I think everyone agrees about the importance of that. However, to collaborate, you need to collaborate on something. You need to come together on specific initiatives with which actually requires resourcing. It's really hard to keep that energy going where it's just a multi-stakeholder process. I've had way too many experiences of cross-divisional collaborative committees, and you have a wonderful collaborative conversation and everybody goes back and does things exactly the same way. But when you bring people together around a project or an initiative and enable people to see the work that they're already doing in that kind of process, then you get the spirit of, this is what I can contribute. Wow, this is what I can contribute. And food is a really powerful way to do that. But I think we can't talk collaboration, we have to practice it. And it takes resources. I mean, Sustain is really struggling for that reason.
I have two quick thoughts on how to collaborate more and better. The first is really a nod to the work of Food Secure Canada, which of course is a membership and individually based organization, represents more than the sum of its parts, but I think it's done a very effective job collaborating with its members and collaborating with industry partners, Canadian Federation of Agriculture as an example, around advocating for national food policy and a national food policy council, as well as strategically integrating academics into those discussions and thinking of them as levers for change. So I think that that's one just concrete example that's played out in the last year or so. The other thing I would point to is the work of our Fledge colleague, Jill Clark, John Hopkins, the Food Policy Network, so integrating or connecting the work of food policy councils across North America. I just think that's another repository, another portal to connect all of these disparate initiatives at different levels and scales, hopefully to better effect.
Thank you very much to the panel. So what I'd like to do now, before I thank the panel and you for being here, is just to highlight a couple of things that emerged for me that seem to be particularly relevant and worth reiterating. The first is the nature of this whole process as being place-based. And I think what became very obvious today is while we have these potential international global agreements and even international initiatives like the Milan Pact, it's really at the city or the city region or the territorial or the regional level where these things get implemented, and that's what's important. And as was mentioned, we need indicators that reflect and speak to people on the ground. That's really important. And one of the conversations around the SDGs, leading up to the SDGs and the indicators that was happening while all of this was being developed, was the relative benefit of having the 167 indicators versus giving voice to people who are on the ground. So people engaging in traditional kinds of agriculture, for example, in our case, in the food systems work that we do. And how do we give equal time and presence to that in the face of what some people would call scientific knowledge that gets captured in the indicators and the targets and everything. So there needs to be a balance and an honoring of that knowledge as much as the indicators. So that's an important thing to do. And that includes the idea of being inclusive and how do we have all of those voices at the table so that we can tell the whole story of the food system. And the other thing that came up that I think is really important to underscore is the need to speak across scales. And I would also add not just across scales, but within urban-rural spaces. Because if we're talking about a food system, we have to speak to everybody in that food system. And that's really where I see some hope in these international agreements, because they really give us the basis for doing that. And thinking about what that geography looks like and how our food sheds actually work and what a bioregional food system is all about, those are very promising areas for moving forward the conversation and bringing together everybody in the food system to have a bigger voice. And I think that's really, Lynn, what you were talking about when you were speaking about getting Food Secure Canada, speaking with Sustain, and talking to organizations like the Laurier Centre for Sustainable Food Systems. That's part of that conversation. And the more we can find those big common things that we can move forward and amplify our voice, the more successful we're going to be in bringing about the transformation that's needed in the food system. So with that, I would like to thank all of you who came this morning. It was really great to have you in the room. If it's okay, we'll be in touch again about upcoming events. If you don't want us to do that, let us know as you're leaving. And finally, I would like to thank our panel. You're all amazing. You're all helping to bring about the change that we need, and we're really grateful to all of you for making the time in your very busy schedules to be with us. So thank you so much. And a final shout out to Elena and Amanda and to our amazing podcasters who have just joined the team in the last couple of weeks. So thank you to you for making this event possible and also for carrying it forward in the digital world. So thanks to you.